Okay, so while we get the translation set up, I want to make sure that we have the correct YouTube link. I'm going to ask one of our panelists to go ahead and put that in the chat in Zoom for all of the attendees so that they can see the latest link. And then I will get us started on the agenda for tonight. So we're going to begin with some remarks from our superintendent and then hear from our chief academic officer as well as our chief systems and services officer about the instructional model for the year and what we're doing to prepare for the opening weeks of school, as well as an update from the state in Assembly Bill 77 and Senate Bill 98 of what's required of districts. We'll also be providing some updates about technology distribution, meal service, and registration. And then we'll get into some more details of when we are able to offer some in-person instruction, what are some of the safety guidelines that we'll be following. We'll hear from an update from one of the doctors that we are working with from UCSF, Benioff Children's Hospital, talking about the different phases of what blended learning could look like, as well as providing some updates about our ordering of PPE, our safety protocols, and our progress to date. And then we have a lot of information here. We're going to be trying to go quickly so we can get through all of it. This deck will be made available to you towards the end. So don't worry if you don't catch all the details the first round through. And also just to be aware, we are in negotiations right now to land on new MOUs with all of our labor partners. So we will be clear about what things are for certain and what things are pending negotiations once those are finalized. So to go ahead and begin, I'm going to introduce our superintendent, Dr. Kyla Johnson-Trammell, and she will kick us off. Kyla?
Excuse me, I was muted. Thank you, Salja, and good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and I do hope that you and your family is remaining safe during everything that we're going through. I will be brief because we do have a lot of information and we want to give everyone the opportunity to be able to share their thoughts and their questions in the chat. As has been stated before, staff will do their absolute best to answer as many questions as they can during our time together. So one of the things that I just want to underscore as a message for our entire presentation is that really the recommendations, and I'm specifically using the word recommendations for two reasons. One, we are in the middle of labor negotiations, and so this is our recommendations for fall opening, but we are going through those discussions with our labor partners. But two, the fact that what we are currently experiencing is uncertain. And so as conditions change, we have to continue to pivot. I mean, as I've said many times, where we are now, we absolutely have to continue to be adaptive leaders and to ensure that our plans and our proposals are nimble and that we can shift, because that's one thing that we're seeing for sure is that we will continue to live in quite a bit of uncertainty for this school year. So what you're seeing in the recommendation, one, is a result of, we had about 105 stakeholders across the district that helped to develop recommendations. Those recommendations were then informed by many of the surveys from parents and from employees. And so what we have tried to do is strike the balance of concerns and desires and recommendations from both the parent community that you can imagine is very diverse in terms of wants and needs, as well as staff concerns, and staff wants and needs. I will say the common denominator is there hasn't been a teacher, a staff member, and obviously a parent who isn't anxious to come back to school. The big tension, as we know, is safety, and both wrestling with the social and the psychological safety of our students the longer they're out of school, with the real concerns that everyone has for various reasons in terms of physical safety. And so what you will see is our recommendations that are striking the balance between the two. we are recommending that we start the year in distance for up to 4 weeks. My chief academic officer will talk a little bit about the details of that, but I do want to underscore throughout the presentation that we're using the word recommendation because we are in the middle of labor negotiation. And I want everyone to get comfortable with us not actually using word final certainty, because even when we get to the point where we have agreement, we know as soon as the ground shifts in terms of our overall environment and conditions, we are going to have to adopt again. And we're going to have to continue to adopt new plans and adapt how it is that we're going to do school for this year. So I want to just, again, I want to appreciate all the stakeholders and parents who have helped us get to the point that we have this far. And I want to urge you to please put your questions in the chat, even if we cannot answer them tonight. I do look through all of the questions, all of the concerns, and we will absolutely use those to move planning forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Janine, who's going to provide a brief labor update, and then we will get into the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent. Next slide. So we are in labor negotiations at this time, and I want to just start with a special thanks to all of our labor partners. This is definitely not traditional negotiations. We are in unprecedented times, to say the least. So all of our labor partners, each labor group, AFSCME, SEIU, CSEA, UAOS, OEA, Teamsters, BCTC, rolled up their sleeves and appointed members to the action teams that was referred to previously. So I just want to send a special thank you to them for doing that, although this is untraditional and very unprecedented. And then secondly, I just wanted to add that we are in negotiations with both AFSCME and OEA. We've started with AFSCME, who represents our custodial services, as well as many of our special education paraeducators, health services, LVNs, and 504 techs. And that is because safety is a priority. And also we are putting an emphasis on providing services to our most vulnerable students. And that does include students with medical conditions, students with in special education. So we've began the process of negotiating with AFSCME around those classifications. And secondly, we are in negotiations with OEA. And I wanted to, in addition to thanking labor partners, also thank you as community members for responding and to surveys that we've put out to let us know what kind of worked last year, what families really need if we are to have distance learning in the fall. And so those recommendations and responses to surveys, as well as the recommendations from our action teams, have informed our initial proposals with OEA at the table. And so we've negotiated with them today. They have a great team. We have a dynamic team at the table. We're proposing to start in distance. I think we're all in agreement that whether it's now, whether it's later, there's always that possibility that we would be falling back to a distance model.
All right, while we wait for Janine to get back on, let's go ahead and move. And I want to echo what Janine was saying, which is that all of our labor partners have really leaned in on this planning process in order to create the recommendations and plans that you're going to see tonight. So Jody, could we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? And so I'm going to be introducing some of the work that we'll be sharing with you tonight around our recommendations for next year. And my name is Salaja Suresh. I am a senior director in the district and coordinated the action team of 105 members who were teachers and principals and parents and central office leaders to come forward with recommendations on what schools should look like next year. And we'll be sharing some of those recommendations as well as some of the final decisions that we've made. And just know that we are, as Janine mentioned, still in negotiations. And so there are a lot of decisions that have yet to be determined in partnership with our labor unions. And so what I want to start with is some of the most important information that has really helped guide our recommendations. And so, Jody, you want to go to the next slide, which is feedback from our community. So over the course of the last 2 months, we've put out a number of surveys. We've had an open thought exchange. We've had many meetings that were held by individual school communities, as well as with the wider OUSD family, and have a lot of really clear themes that have come out that have guided our recommendations for this year. So really top of mind for a lot of people is around access to technology. We're going to be talking about that tonight, of what the plan is around distributing devices, making sure that families have access, about making sure that there is improved communication from the district as well as from schools around how families can support their children with success with distance learning, to make sure that we're attending to students' mental health and socio-emotional needs, and that there's more time for online instruction. As everyone knows, we had to pivot very quickly to online learning in the spring. We learned a lot from that experience. And now how do we make sure that students have access to more than just a half an hour, 1 hour, or a short period of time each day? And the new state guidelines are really going to shape how we provide online instruction over the course of this year. And in particular, how are we making sure that students who need that additional support in order to access distance learning is getting that? Some of the themes that we're seeing in a lot of the in-person meetings that we've been holding or on Zoom are thinking about, when we do return to in-person learning, how do we make sure that it's safe, that we can actually do what we are planning on, that we can afford it, and that it is enough. So one of the things that you'll be hearing about tonight are the team of doctors that we've been consulting with, who have been critical partners in us really making sure that our safety measures reflect the latest science and the latest safety guidance. And to make sure that we are providing an option for students as well as teachers who need to remain in distance-only learning, and that we are ensuring that there is some level of consistency and accountability throughout the district, so that parents, no matter which school their child attends, are receiving the same kind of level of support and service when we are in distance learning. And to make sure, again, that we're tending to those socio-emotional needs and really around relationship building, that we, especially in distance learning, and we don't have the ability to build those relationships in person, that we are really figuring out how do we do that, and how do we build relationships with our newest students, as well as students who can't really engage in the same way with distance learning, and that those relationships are strong to build academically upon that. And then with that as the sort of main themes that we're hearing in a number of these feedback sessions, I want to pass the presentation over to Dr. Sandra Aguilera, who's our Chief Academic Officer, to go over the instructional model for this year.
Thank you, Sasha. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandra Aguilera. I'm the Chief Academic Officer for our district. I'll take you through the instructional models for elementary and secondary schools. I first just want to start by saying a huge thank you to the action team. The action team that Sasha was leading was 100 people large, and they were teachers, parents, central office staff, department leads, custodians, so various people in our district that really want to provide their guidance as to how we should be thinking about the fall. And with that, I will take you through the instructional model, which was developed by a smaller subset of that group. And I really just want to highlight that they used the safety guidance and the science guidance that has been out there in our educational community to make up these models. And not only did they look at that guidance, they went and asked principals what they thought of those plans, asked teachers what they thought of those plans, and then came back and refined based on the feedback that they were receiving. We also did take these models to different family and community forums where we also collected a lot of information. So this just was not, created by only like a central office. It was created by a team. So with that, I would like to walk us through those plans.
Sandra, could you be a little bit closer to your mic where it's a little bit muffled? We're getting some requests for you to speak louder.
Okay, let me see. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
I can make sure to yell a little bit louder. Okay. So our base instructional model is distance learning, and that is because we are not always sure if we can provide in-person learning. We do have a way to measure the phases that we would like to implement, but because we may go back and forth into distance learning and into what is called blended learning, which is a combination of internet learning plus in-person instruction. We do want to make sure that our distance learning is strong. We did receive feedback from the surveys that our families did to say that they gave us direct feedback on what would make distance learning better. The biggest piece is having opportunities for students to learn not only in whole group class sessions, but also in small groups. So when you see the plans roll out from your particular school, you will see that we've paid attention to that feedback. So we also want to stress, and this question has come up a lot in our community sessions, if students that or families that do not wish to participate in-person learning, if they would have a distance learning option all year long. And the answer is yes, they will have that option. So wanting to stress that distance learning is our base instructional model. With that, you'll also see that the group has created 3 phases, and they're the blended learning phases. And what you'll see is a difference in those phases is that we have groups of students that will come back, and with those groups of students, we're focusing on students that need the most support. And that doesn't mean that other students won't receive any support. It's just that the in-person sessions will focus on students that we are seeing through assessments and through parent feedback that they need more support, that distance learning is not as beneficial to them. So for safety, we've looked at 6 key safety factors. Later on in the presentation, we'll be going through what that means. Also for equity, we are looking at what our students need. So you'll see specific groups of students called out as examples in the models that we will go through. Every 4 to 6 weeks, we will be looking at how we're doing in each of the phases to determine if we can move into the next phase. If we are not ready to move into the next phase, we will not be moving forward into that next phase. Next slide, please. Okay, so this question has...
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a second? I know that some people are struggling with interpretation right now. We're going to ask our interpreters to go ahead and put in some of the summaries in the chat if the audio isn't working. Okay, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Sandra.
Okay, so then we move into our Strong Start plan. And I do want to keep stressing that these are plans, these are recommendations that we're making to start off the year, that we are still in negotiations with our labor partners. So we are planning to open August 10th. We are planning for distance learning to last up to 4 weeks. So that way we have a chance to start strong, and I'll take you through what that Strong Start plan looks like. And we are saying we're doing a phased-in approach to in-person learning. So the families can plan on at least the first 4 weeks of instruction to be in distance learning. So the Strong Start plan is a plan that will be individual to school sites. But that doesn't mean school sites will be making up their own plans that don't fall in line with some new legislation that I will take us through. The Strong Start plan at each school site for students is meant to call out specifically how outreach and connection will happen between the school site, teachers, staff, and students. There will be opportunities to distribute learning packets, textbooks, technology, and there will be a focus on orientation to how to do online learning. And we will start assessments, so that way we know how students are doing. For staff, the focus, and that's again the first 4 weeks, is meant to be support and preparation. So staff have opportunities to look at assessments, look at the scope and sequence for instruction. We have district-wide scope and sequence documents that we provide our teachers. However, due to our current context, we need to adjust that scope and sequence. And so there will be an opportunity for teachers and staff to go through those more deeply. And there will be also an orientation with stakeholders between our staff and families. So that way everyone is on the same page in terms of the path forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so I referenced this new legislation. It is called AB 77. And from that, our district is required to do a few key essential things. We are required to create a learning, continuity, and attendance plan. And that plan would be available for comment to the public through different stakeholder groups. And that plan describes very specific items like instructional minutes and days. In terms of the instructional minutes, there is a reduction by grade level. So each year, a school needs to submit their master schedule, or how many minutes a day a student is learning. And the guidance has been reduced. Kindergarten is nearly the same. Secondary is reduced significantly. There's online and in-person instruction minutes that are acceptable. So that means that in order to meet the instructional minutes, the state has said you can do a combination of in-person and online instruction to meet those requirements. There's also a range required in terms of 3 to 4 hours per day. So that gives you a sense of how many hours a day our students will be in class. Instructional days is still 180 days. There needs to be some form of contact with every day for those 180 days. Next are the required supports. So during distance learning, our district must provide technology and internet access. There also needs to be grade level content. We still must teach the standards. I really want to pause here for special education. There have been a lot of questions about how we would provide special education services. We are required to implement IEP, the individual education plans. Those are the plans that the team of parents and teachers have agreed upon. So for those plans, we are required to implement those services. The language is still as best as possible in a distance learning setting. So we do have continued plans to do both online and in-person, both instruction and assessments, because we do need to go back to doing assessments. It's really difficult to do assessments online. You basically can't. So we have to do some sort of in-person interaction so that way we can continue those assessments. We will have opportunities specifically for our Community Advisory Council or Committee to see those specific special education plans, because we have made special or specific plans for our special education staff. Our English language supports are also called out in this continuity and attendance plan. We must still provide what is called designated and integrated language development. So that means that teachers must still teach our English language learners in an integrated fashion, which is language through the content, and then designated, which is the how to speak English and how to read English, how to write English in a more direct way. And we do have specific guidance for teachers of language learners, so that way they have support on how to adjust their instruction to best teach our English language learners. So all of what has been...
I just want to pause and give the interpreters time to catch up.
I saw the interpretation globe come up.
Exactly. So Jody, if you could go to the previous slide just so that we can pause and make sure that interpretation is all caught up. And so we will give our interpreters a few seconds here, and then we'll pick up where Dr. Aguilera left off on the next slide. So again, if you're looking for interpretation, it's on Zoom, and you can click on the globe button to log on for Spanish and Chinese. And I believe we're still waiting for our Arabic translator to log on right now.
You want for me to wait a moment, yes? Okay.
Okay, great. Jody, let's go ahead and go back. Thank you so much, Sandra. Go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of the next bullet, which is daily interaction with staff and peers. As I mentioned before, there must be contact with students on a daily basis. That does not mean it has to only be by the teacher. Other staff may have contact with students, but our students need to be in some sort of interaction with the staff and with their peers on a daily basis. We will be taking a modified attendance. This past spring, we had a manual way of doing that didn't really work that well because it was very labor intensive. We will be going back to using our student system called ARIES to track daily participation and attendance. The learning continuity and attendance plan also includes tiered supports. So it breaks down for us how we should be addressing when students are not moving forward academically, and also if a student is absent more than 3 days. There are specific strategies that we are going to include in our plan. We will collect your feedback on that plan prior to approving that plan in September. There is a state deadline of September 15th for doing, September 30th, sorry, for completing that item. And I take you through that legislation because it's important for you to know that we will have a district-wide plan. And from that, school sites will need to think about how to implement the specific details that we have written into the district-wide plan in their setting. It doesn't mean that it will be completely different, but they do have to do some adjusting because every school is a bit different in terms of their structures and their systems. But there will definitely be some commonalities, and that's why we've raised these with you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to take you through elementary and secondary specifically. So the design for elementary distance learning is that students have weekly outcomes that they will be supported to reach. So the students and the families will know on a weekly basis what they are supposed to be learning. I mentioned before we are modifying the scope and sequence using our curriculum and also the integration, and this is new, of learning platforms. We have taken the feedback and from families to know, okay, it felt a little choppy. How can this design for instruction be seamless between the curriculum and the platforms? And so we will have specific time with our teachers, our support staff, and our principals to take them through these different scopes and sequences by grade level So that way there is some coherence about the instructional model. Lead teachers right now are helping to create the content. Also, teachers will be asked to provide not only whole group instruction, but small group instruction. There is also an opportunity to use the outdoors as a learning space. So there are modifications that you'll see on campuses to help support implementing more outdoor learning as compared to being indoors all the time. In terms of content, we are focusing on daily foundational literacy, daily reading, writing, and discussion. I mentioned English language development, that includes integrated and designated ELD, daily math lessons, and then on a weekly basis, providing social studies and science. We cannot forget about social studies and science in the instructional plan. There will also be community meetings to start off the days, so that way students have that social emotional learning and support. And then there will be access to PE, music, and art as usual. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll go through the secondary model. And this is different than what students normally have experienced. It is a 9-week, we're calling them mini-mesters, but for families, you may have also heard of this as like quarters, but in our system, we're calling it mini-mesters, and this is what the team designed. So what you'll notice is a breakdown of the possible classes that students could be taking. So what you'll notice is fewer classes the first 9 weeks. It's meant to be 9 weeks with 3 classes plus electives. Sorry, that does include electives. 9 weeks in the next set of curricula, and that would compose the fall semester. And then in the spring, you would do another set of classes for 9 weeks, and then rotate onto the last set for 9 weeks. It is meant to provide an opportunity for teachers to team teach. So if your child is in secondary, that's both 6 through 8 and 9 through 12, they could experience less classes for shorter periods of time, but that doesn't mean overall they're getting less time in that particular content area. There is also the possibility, and again, these are proposed way of learning. There is also the possibility of teachers having less student contacts. Right now, there's about 150 contacts in the contract, and this would provide teachers an opportunity to have less contacts and focus in more on with their students. And there's an opportunity for team teaching. So when the English teacher is teaching, the physical education teacher is helping with more of the wellness checks with students. Next slide, please. So I wanted to leave you with a glimpse as to what is already started. So what you'll see is a lot of work that is in motion. There are a few key dates. July 27th is when our principals come back to work officially. And we have a series of learning that we take them through. So all of the plans that I have mentioned will be ready by the 27th because they need to be ready for principals and their teams to digest and get ready for involving more teachers in that planning the week of August, starting August 5th. So those are big key dates that everyone should know about. These are the normal ways that we bring our staff back. We will have opportunities for more learning prior to that to get our staff ready to implement these plans. So there's the scope and sequence. The assessment team has already recommended assessments and will be taking leadership and teachers through what that looks like to collect their feedback. There's also, I described the engagement strategies and the process for tracking student engagement. We have to have a real focus on this going into the fall. We'll also be able to explain how we're intervening and targeting certain students that need more support. in the academic program. We also have a new social emotional learning guide that we'll be taking our school leadership teams through. It is really comprehensive. It is from an organization called CASTLE, and we are a partner with them, so we have access to their guidance. With that, I will turn it over to Preston, who will take us through technology information. At a later phase, or later in the slides, I'll take us through more of the phases and how we'll be phasing in-person learning.
All right, thank you, Sandra. So I'm going to launch into, with our Strong Start plan, technology is going to be a critical component of that. And we're very fortunate in Oakland to have a community campaign that was an amazing success, a partnership between the mayor's office, OUSD, Tech Exchange, and the Ed Fund. I believe we reached our fundraising goal in just a few days and immediately went into action to try to get the devices. It's a testament to the deep level of support in our community to make sure that kids get access to the tools that they'll need to engage in distance learning. So a couple of things like on this slide that are just really critical. One is that this is a need-based program and families must fill out the tech survey, and they're building that tech survey right now. It'll go online on August the 3rd. And so that determines the tech needs that people are having at home and also which individuals qualify. Right now in Oakland, we left out about 18,000 student devices, and they're still out there. And so we've also purchased new computers that we will be checking out to some students on a loan basis if the Oakland Undivided campaign devices haven't arrived in time. And so, and in situations where students don't have devices, you can imagine in early elementary that there will be packets that will go home for students and families while they're waiting for the devices to arrive. We expect to be distributing the Oakland Undivided devices in the 3rd week of August. What's been on order for OUSD is about 19,000 Chromebooks that will go home and be delivered and be the students' actual Chromebooks. And also there's going to be internet connectivity devices for about 15,000 or more families in OUSD. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I think that this is really a critical slide that kind of is going to, I'm going to walk you through the process. And it all starts with that technology survey on the August the 3rd. Our solution for every home is to have a computer that is based on like a survey of family needs. And then we also are checking families to make sure that they have access to the internet. And then there is ongoing tech support for both families and students to get connected. So on August 3rd, they'll complete the technology survey. That survey will then qualify you based on your home technology needs and your socioeconomic status. Families will then be approved for particular devices, and we're still working out the distribution, but it'll either be home delivery or it will be at the school site. And then students will actually receive that Chromebook and begin instruction, and then there'll be ongoing technology support for families. So more to come on that, but definitely, mark the date August the 3rd. In terms of the tech survey, and then also that for the beginning of school, which starts on August the 10th. Next slide, please. All right, so one of the big investments Oakland has made is into ensuring that our food service continued through the summer. To date, we have served approximately 3.4 million meals for our district, when a lot of districts across the entire, entire state shut down their meal service. We continue to offer food throughout, and will continue through the summer. So as we begin in distance learning for the beginning of the school year, we'll remain in this form of meal distribution, where we have the 24 sites across the district that will be offering food for families. Any family can come in and pick up that food, Once we move to in-person instruction, we will start to structure the food distribution so that it aligns to that model. So for example, if students come in person 2 days a week, that essentially they would get food at the breakfast and lunch at the school site. Then on the third day, when they leave on that second day, they would end up taking lunches for the next 3 days. And that is breakfast, lunches, and suppers. So we'll build like kind of a hybrid model as we move into the blended learning, but we have a deep commitment to continue meal service for the city of Oakland. And so the next slide, please. So a quick line around a registration. I saw it in the chat a little bit earlier. There's really, registration's open now. We encourage families to complete registration before the first day of school, which is August the 10th. There are 2 different ways that you can register. One, there's an online strategy that you can use to register, and then school sites will be reaching out to students that have been assigned to particular schools, and they'll begin their registration process for on-site. Some of those schools, I think one of the big questions is like, what if I don't have access to technology to be able to fill out that survey? School sites will have an opportunity for you to fill out that online technology survey as part of the on-site registration at the school site. So I think that's it for now. That was a lot of information, but I think we're going to turn it over to some questions at this point.
Great. So I will give our staff members a chance to go ahead and summarize some of the themes that they're seeing in the chat, both on our YouTube live stream as well as here in the chat on Zoom. And I can address some of those questions and pass them off to Sandra and Preston as well. Definitely hearing a lot of questions come up around a lot of the announcements that are happening in other districts that are also announcing that they are starting in distance learning. Those announcements don't have a direct relationship to what OUSD decides to do. I think every community is really trying to respond to the situation in their particular context. But it is interesting to see the trends as they are emerging across the country. Other questions that are coming up are around the technology distribution. One thing to just be mindful of is, we are ordering 19,000 devices. So is San Francisco, so is West Contra Costa, so is Los Angeles. Every district all over the world is trying to meet this new era in ordering devices and getting their families set up. So, the supply chain for technology as well as everything else is generally delayed around the world. And so we're doing what we can. We started ordering all the way back in April so that we can be ready for the start of the school year. But there are thousands of devices that we have to make sure that we get tracked and into students' hands in time. Some other questions that are coming up are around grading and attendance. We'll have that information available in time for school, but just know that the plan is to be providing grades to students this year, as well as taking attendance, both for online as well as in-person instruction when we're able to do that. And that is also a requirement from the state, is that we do track attendance and do re-engage students who are not joining us in the distance learning environment. And because we began planning relatively early in Oakland, we began planning back in May. The state's guidance didn't actually come out until the end of June. And we're here now 2 weeks later, trying to make sense of it and trying to build our systems to meet the state guidance. And this is definitely a situation that all of the districts are in, as well as all of the software companies, as they have to rebuild their software to meet the new state requirements, that we can't just use the same old systems in the same old ways, that we really have to adapt the way that we use them to meet the new requirements that have never existed before. And so just as a reminder, a few things. One, we will make this video available online, as well as the deck for anyone who missed earlier portions of the presentation. We will also be providing this translated for those of you who weren't able to access translation in the beginning. And with that, I want to make sure that we continue on so we stay on time. So Jody, could you take us to the next slide, please? Great. So we talked a little bit about what distance learning could look like for the first 4 weeks of the year and some of the things that we are preparing for. At the same time, we are preparing for bringing students back. We know that this is something that a number of our families want. We have heard over and over again that this is something that they need and that's something that their students also need. And so we are preparing for this distant start to the year, but we're also trying to prepare for when it is safe to bring students back. What does that look like? And a reminder for those of you who missed the update at the beginning, we are in negotiations with our labor partners right now, and a lot of decisions will be pending the result of those negotiations. And so what I'm talking about here is how we are preparing for when we do reach those agreements, for when we are able to bring some students back for some in-person instruction. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Again, distance learning is our base model. We know that all of our students over the course of the year will have distance learning as an element of their instructional program. To start the year, that will be the core instructional program for all of our students. And we've learned a lot from what happened in the spring by listening to students, by listening to families, by listening to teachers, and are trying to address those areas of improvement for the fall. When we do begin in-person instruction, the goal is to begin it in phases where we are bringing some students back in each phase while we're widening access over the course of the year. And we're doing that to make sure that our safety protocols can be followed and that we are able to actually bring students back safely and not just open the doors and have everyone back at the same time. And really our highest priority here is the safety of our students and our staff. That we are already beginning to order PPE, that we're already beginning to develop protocols and print signs, that we're really doing our best to prepare for this as soon as is possible. And we're committing to communicate with our families and to make sure that students and parents and family members, as well as our staff members, are getting updates from us about the ways in which we are preparing to bring students back when we are able to do that. Next slide, please. So this is some of the information that we've been getting back from families in some of the surveys that we have put out. When we look at the numbers across the different language of surveys that we are putting out there, we do see that there are a majority of families who have participated in the English survey who do want to return to some form of in-person instruction. But a solid almost quarter are not willing to bring their children back to some form of in-person learning, which is why we are offering the option to all families to stay in distance learning if that is what they choose for their family. And then a number of other families, about 15% or so, who are not really sure which way they're going to go. And if we look at our Spanish-speaking families, just about under half who are reluctant to send their children back to in-person learning right now. Again, about a quarter who have decided that they will not be sending their child back to school in person. And then the respondents to our Chinese language survey, where it is almost half who are in the no category of being unwilling or not desiring right now to send their children back to in-person learning. And when we dug a little bit deeper with those families to say, well, what is your reason why you might be reluctant to begin in-person learning? There are a few factors who rose to the top. One was just obviously safety concerns of, I don't think that the safety measures that will be in place around masks and around social distancing are sufficient. And others are worried about students who might be at risk or other family members who might be at risk. And those are things that we obviously don't have control about, and so want to make sure that we are supporting those families and staying in distance learning if that is what is best for them and for their children. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so this is, again, some information from families about what kind of schedule should we be able to go to blended learning, what kind of schedule would work for them and work for their family. And as you can see, the results are kind of all over the spectrum, where there is a majority of families who are supporting, all day 3 or 4 days, or all day 1 or 2 days a week, that those are strongly favorable. Those green and purple lines indicate that they're in favor of this particular plan. And then you can see over towards the right that there is the option of, half days, just 1 or 2 days a week, which the blue line indicates doesn't really work for our family. It is a burden for working parents to try and navigate that particular schedule that is very shortened. And so this was useful information for us in thinking about how to design a blended model where we're able to have students back for at least a few days a week for an extended period of time. And again, we can't say exactly what those schedules might be because we have to make sure that we finalize our contracts with our unions before we're able to do that. But as Dr. Aguilera, our Chief Academic Officer, mentioned earlier in the meeting, the state does have new instructional minutes requirements for all school districts, which starts at kindergarten, which is 3 hours a day, and goes up to secondary all the way up to 12th grade, where it's about 4 hours a day. And so those are the new daily instructional minutes that districts are asked to abide by. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And so here I want to go ahead and pass it back to Preston Thomas, who's our Chief Systems and Services Officer, and he can talk a little bit about what are the county guidelines around school reopening of the safety protocols that we're expected to follow.
Thank you, Salja. As you can see on the slide, and I won't go through it in detail, but the county, state, and federal guidance has changed repeatedly throughout this process as we learn. I mean, it's a natural process of learning. What we do know today is that cloth face coverings will be for all students. Face shields are going to be an added level of protection for staff, and we'll talk about what we have available currently. We need to partner with parents. We need multiple screenings. We need screenings before kids ultimately come to school and also at school. We're going to maintain the physical distancing. And really the key thing around the epidemiology of this is to keep kids in small groups, stable groups that don't change very often, so they get to interact with a smaller group of students. And it is okay for teachers to work with multiple cohorts at a time. And then there's other precautions that we will be putting into place. Can you move to the next slide, please? So this is a slide that many of you have seen before. And I just want to say that, as a former science teacher, my son, I started him off on a project where he was tracking the number of cases in Oakland and around the state. And, when we went exactly 4 months ago, when we went into distance learning for the district, there were 0 cases in Oakland. And now we can see in this chart that there's tremendous numbers of cases of COVID-19. And this chart is cumulative. So it shows you from the beginning of the epidemic to where we are today. And I just keep bringing this up because really the most critical thing for us as a community is to continue to practice social distancing, to continue to wear masks, make sure that we're supporting each other. At the beginning of this, when we started food distribution, most of the people that were working in food distribution, none of them knew anybody that had COVID-19. Now everybody knows somebody that has been infected with the coronavirus, and that is our new reality. And so one of the things that I just want to constantly remind folks, and for everybody on this call, to continue to remind people to wear their masks and continue the social distancing and wash hands. If you could go to the next slide. And this goes, before I pass it over to Dr. Dana Long, I just wanted to talk through this because this is really the complexity that lies at the heart of starting slow. One of the things, if you could look at it, it's complex for all of us. I saw some, comments in the chat about people that are really struggling with multi-generational households and having to work and have kids at home. It is incredibly complex for all of us. And one of the things I just wanted to say, and this kind of data comes from the state, is that while children are getting COVID-19, right? Across the entire state, no children have at this point died because of COVID-19. And I'm somebody that has 3 teenagers at home. And my wife and I both work in essential roles where we're out in the community and we bring that home. And we also have have people in our homes that have medical conditions that are, it's incredibly complex. So one of the most important things that we can do within kind of our own procedures around coming back to school is making sure that we develop protocols, that we go slowly into developing these, test them over and over again, like we did with food distribution, and we learn from it, and we create a safe environment for kids, and we bring a safe environment for our our loved ones and our employees. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dana Long, who is going to walk us a little bit more through some of the complexities of COVID-19 and some of the science behind it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Dr. Long, and I'm a pediatrician at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland. I am working with a fantastic team of pediatricians from across the Bay Area, from San Francisco and Oakland, who are very dedicated and committed to supporting everybody in this process. We want students to be safe, we want teachers to be safe, we want parents to be safe. And I have to say that I give so much congratulations and thumbs up just to the very intentional work that Oakland Unified School District is doing right now in order to ensure safety. Next slide. So I want to give a brief summary of what we know so far. And our role as the pediatric consults to work with all of you guys is to provide the science as we know it so that we can make sure that decisions are grounded in safety for everybody. What we know so far is that children get COVID less often and become less ill than adults. And the scientific reason behind this is because there's a receptor that's in the nose of adults and people over the age of 10 that the COVID virus binds to in order to enter our bodies. And that children less than 10 simply don't have that receptor. And so they're not getting as sick as often. We know that children who become positive are getting it most likely from other adults, and particularly other adults that are in their household, and that they do not seem to be the major transmitters of this virus to other children. The way that we think that children are becoming positive is from adults and not other children. I just can't stress that enough. We do think that middle school children and high school children have transmission patterns that are much more similar to adults than elementary school students. And understanding that there is international literature and there's more literature coming out of summer camps and childcare in the United States, but we are making the best decisions that we can. While we recognize that virus transmission is serious, and this COVID is a serious illness, we also know that there are other silent pandemics that are going along with COVID, and that we are seeing a lot of adversity, and that adversity is causing anxiety and depression, lack of social and developmental support for a lot of our kids and their families. There are increased reports of domestic violence and less reporting of child abuse in homes, partly because kids are not around adults that are mandated reporters. We also know that this has been really hard for families and that there's huge financial strain. We're seeing a lot of food insecurity in families, and families are just struggling every day to get by. Next slide. So the way that COVID is most likely transmitted is it's not so much on surfaces, right? We're thinking that the main ways that the virus is transmitted is from respiratory droplets, meaning that an infected person has droplets that are expelled from breathing, from talking, from singing, from shouting, and that Breathing transmits the droplets about 3 feet. When you are talking, they can go about 6 feet. If you are coughing or sneezing or shouting, the droplets can go as far as about 12 to 15 feet. The way that we protect ourselves in this environment is that we wear masks, right? And those masks have to cover our nose and our mouth, maintaining social distancing of 6 feet, having face shields or eye protection, hand washing. And when hand washing, it's washing the hands with hand sanitizer or soap and water for 30 seconds. Staying home if you are sick, if you have any symptoms whatsoever, symptoms ranging from fever, cough, shortness of breath, runny nose, sometimes loss of the sense of smell, red eyes, headaches, nausea. That all staff and students at all times must wear face masks, and those masks are surgical or cloth masks. And that really for school settings, N95s are not needed unless it's a very special circumstance. Next slide. So throughout this process, we as pediatricians are advocating and moving forward, being willing to have office hours to talk a lot more about these details with everybody. But the bottom line is, what can we do now to protect our community? It's to wear a mask whenever you're outside, whenever you're in public, to maintain 6 feet unless it's completely unavoidable, to wash your hands, to use hand sanitizer, and honestly, to get children to start wearing a mask now to get them ready for in-person instruction. So I'm going to pass it over to the school district, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Long. So I'm going to pause here for a second and let our Arabic translator go ahead and explain interpretation here so we can make sure that we're meeting those families' needs. Hussam? Okay, great. And then I'm going to bring Dr. Sandra Aguilera, our Chief Academic Officer, back up so that she can get into some more details about the in-person models. And just as a reminder, what we have been talking about are some of the options for blended learning that we are developing should it be safe to bring students back in person. And a reminder that some prerequisites here are, first, the state has to say that it is okay for schools to reopen. Then the county has to say it is safe for schools to reopen. And then districts will be left to decide how best to reopen and bring students back for in-person instruction. So we are working on preparing those plans for when it is safe to do so. Right now, we will be beginning in distance learning for up to 4 weeks for the start of the year, because that is what we have heard is needed right now. We want to provide that level of clarity to our families. Dr. Aguilera.
Great, thank you, Selja. So we've had a chance to hear the instructional model. We've heard what the families and staff have said and survey data. And we've taken an opportunity to look at the science and safety measures that we are considering. What I'll do next is take you through the phases and the thinking that has been done by the instructional action group to set forth the plan as we go more into in-person learning. So what you're looking at is a progression starting on the left-hand side. The red area is noting the strong start weeks in distance learning. So we've gone through what that phase would look like, or what that learning would look like. As we go into the first phase of blended learning, it is a very limited in-person instruction. What all students would receive is a check-in, check-out 1 to 2 times per week. Some students would receive additional in-person small group instruction based on need. And all of our moderate, severe SDC students and our mental health enriched classes would come to campus every day. There is also an additional plan for initial English language proficiency assessment that must be done annually. And there's also a plan for our special education assessments to begin. So again, this is the first phase for elementary for in-person learning. As we go into phase 2, there would be a priority for high-need students. So again, all students at this time would be going through groupings in small groups. They would be either part of the A group, B group, or C group, and there would be a rotation of once per week. Some students would have additional time for in-person learning. So that means in addition to their ABC rotation, they would get more time. And again, all mild, moderate, this is new. So all mild, moderate, severe STC students and our mental health classes would come to campus every day. Notice that for phase 2, there would be an emphasis on 8 to 10 students per class with their teacher. Going into blended learning phase 3, we focus on rotations. So that would provide small groups of students in either an A or B rotation. And they would have sessions twice per week instead of once per week. Some students would still have additional time that's in addition to their A or B group. And our mild, moderate, mental health enriched and inclusion classes, so notice inclusion is added to be on campus every day. And this is a slight increase to 12 to 15 students per class. Next slide, please. So what this table explains are the phases. So if you look at each set for phase 1, there is a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it gives you a sense of what the week would look like for your child. So there could be on Mondays the check-in sessions with students. Then we would go into small group sessions. That's the A, B, and C groups. So it's the small group in-person instruction. And then you have the checkouts on Friday. So your bookend on Mondays and Fridays with check-ins and check-out. And there would be opportunities for certain groups to come in for small group instruction. Sorry, I referred to phase 2 as A, B, and C. So phase 2, that is where we introduce a 3-day rotation. So students are either in an A, B, or C group, and they would come once that week. But then on what you can see on Thursday is an opportunity for small group intervention. So it means that students that could use more support to advance their learning would come an additional day. And then there would be time on Friday for teacher professional development and collaboration. So phase 3, there are 2 options that the committee organized and planned. You can see that there is one approach to do week 1 of the month as all A's coming, so all the A group of students. And for week 2, all B group coming to school in person in small groups. For the option 2, there's a different way of looking at this during the week. There could be 2 days for group A with a day in the middle, Wednesday, for more intense cleaning and professional development, and then go into 2 days for group B, and then vice versa for the second week. So we're providing different options to consider. Next slide, please. We'll go into the secondary model now. So again, the red area we went through, that is up to the first 4 weeks for strong start weeks in distance learning. And then we go into blended learning phase 1, which is very limited in-person learning. So we have middle and high school students that are considered secondary students. This is providing one-to-one advisory check-ins on campus. So every 1, 2, or 3 weeks, depending on the student. There's also the same attention to the English language proficiency assessment and special education assessments that would be implemented. There's also this idea for students to go to a hub site instead of, as an example, if they live in West Oakland going to an East Oakland school, or East Oakland going to a West Oakland school, instead of the transportation needed for that, there's this idea of hub sites. For secondary and phase 1, all Mod Sev, moderate severe SDC students and our mental health classes would be on campus every day. For phase 2, there would be a prioritizing of high need students. So what you'll notice is that advisory check-ins would continue, and there would be additional on-campus small group support based on student needs. So we focused in on foster, unsheltered, the transitional grades, and then your first year newcomers, and any students that have not engaged in instruction, they have not been participating. That would be a focus in on that group of students, so that way we can bring them into in-person learning. And we would continue with our moderate severe STC students, the mental health classes, and adding mild moderate students to come to campus every day. For phase 3, there are 2 separate options, one for middle school and one for high school. For middle school, you'll notice an A-B-C rotation, 1 to 2 days per week. Our mild, moderate, severe students, mental health and inclusion students, that's adding inclusion students during this rotation, would come to campus. For high school, the advisory check-ins would continue. You would bring additional high need students to campus for additional support. And again, you would continue with our mild, moderate, severe students and our mental health, and we would add, in this phase, inclusion students would come to the campus. So again, the recommendation is to implement mini-mesters where students are experiencing 3 to 4 classes each quarter, each mini-mester, instead of the same workload that they have had in the past. Next slide, please. Okay, and with that, I would like to hand it off to Preston to talk through how we would go through the different phases.
Great, thank you, Sandra. And so, you know, one of the things in terms of these phases, I just want to, that there are some real critical variables that we're going to be looking at as we consider moving into these phases. And I just wanted to highlight one of the things that I've seen it in the chat is that while there have been consistently about 25% of our families that are saying, I want distance learning for the entire year, there are about 50% of our families that continue to say, I need some in-person level of instruction for my student and for my circumstances. And so these phases are really around how we will move into more in-person instruction as the conditions, you know, across both the county come into play within our district. And so the 6 factors, but there are more, but these are the 6 primary factors. We're looking at cases within schools. What is the level of PPE available? A system for system checks to make sure that staff and students are constantly checking for symptoms. The physical capacity of our classrooms to see like what is the actual spaces. And even today we've been starting to do some walkthroughs and video footage of what classrooms could look like, because every classroom is different. They have different desks, they have different sizes, they have different doors, different windows, and going through and analyzing all of those different elements. The daily cleaning and sanitizing that needs to happen, and what is the level of transportation that's available. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of goes through an overall readiness of where we are today. And just kind of want to walk through this slide with everyone is that, you know, in phase 1, we're anticipating it's about 10% of the student population. There's about 36,000 students in Oakland Unified School District. So it's about 4,000 students that would be back across the 82 schools. And then phase 2 would bring in probably about 25% of students, and then phase 3 would go up to 50% of students. Right now, I'm going to go through some of those specific variables and just talk about like kind of what is in place for each of those pieces. So in-school transmission, we believe that we have developed our protocols that are deeply aligned with Alameda County Public Health Department, and that those protocols, whenever there is a case of in-school transmission, that either the cohort or the school, depending upon the circumstances, would move back to distance learning. So anytime we're talking about phases, know that we would be monitoring whether or not cases emerged within the school. And then the default, as Dr. Aguilera said earlier, is that you would go back to that distance learning. The second piece is personal protective equipment, and we've done an amazing job at like resourcing personal protective equipment, and we feel like we have the PPE in place to go back. Even if we needed to go back 50% of students, we have the PPE in stock right now in the warehouse. We are developing currently a system of symptoms checks for staff across the entire district. It's where every staff member would have to kind of check in to say whether or not they were had the symptoms or not. We plan to have that in place by the 5th. We have done an analysis, and our RAD team did an amazing job doing a facilities calculator that reviews all the characteristics within the school. And we do feel like we have done an analysis where we could get cohorts of between 10 and 14 kids in particular classes across the district, and we've mapped that out. Sanitizing, this has been a key thing in the chat, like sanitizing and cleaning. Clearly there's going to be the ongoing cleaning that would happen normally within school, but there's this added level of sanitizing that we need to make sure that we're doing across all the high touch surfaces within the classrooms, the desks. And initially in the first 2 phases, one of the things that we would be able to do would we be able to take some of our custodians that are at sites that would not necessarily be an in-person instruction and move them to other locations. But at the place where we move into the phase 3, where we have 50% of students in classes, we would need to fill our vacancies and definitely increase our subpool to be able to do the additional cleaning. Transportation is probably one of the largest challenges that we'll face. AC Transit has already given out its guidelines around what they're planning to do through December, which means that they'll be at about 25% of capacity, which we do feel would allow us to go into phase 1 and phase 2. But once we get to phase 3, there might be additional costs for the district in terms of adding additional lines for students to get to schools. And some of those schools we already know are like Montera, Skyline, and some of our schools like Oakland International, where students travel a significant distance to get to those campuses. So, and then finally, the other part of that element would be the special ed transportation as well. Finally, there is signage, and there are plans around signage to get in place for school that would be done by 8/5. So before even staff comes back, we would have all the appropriate signage up in the facilities. Next slide, please. So just, wanted to reiterate in terms of the personal protective equipment. We immediately started purchasing from the day that I think that we went into the initial shelter in place and went to distance learning in March. We put in several of our first orders, but what we have, and you can see the special ed team there that is doing some of the assessments right now. They're picking up their PPE at the district warehouse. We have adult surgical masks, face shields, children's masks, hand sanitizer, thermometers. We have the specialized PPE for nurses, ECE and custodial. And so all of those things, and we're still in discussions with our labor partners as to what would be all of the PPE we would need to provide so that the staff is safe and students are safe. And that is something that we're in constant dialogue and adding more and more elements. For example, one of the things that we just ordered today was the see-through masks, because we know for students that are learning a language or younger students, they do need to see the face and the mouth of their teacher. And so we put in an order for some of those things. We have things ordered that are anticipating that they'll be delivered prior to the beginning of school, which are electrostatic sprayers and the cloth masks for both staff and students. And one of the things about electrostatic sprayers, I think a lot of people have seen these on a lot of commercials where they're spraying disinfectant and things like that. Really, the key thing about the electrostatic sprayers is it's doing the same level of disinfecting that you could do by wiping down a surface, but it's far more efficient for our custodians to be able to get more surface and to be able to cover more parts of the building. So that's one of the reasons why we're bringing those electrostatic sprayers on board. The other thing is that so right now, we are going to give teacher kits of PPE, that each teacher would get a classroom set of the PPE that they would need for their classrooms. We're building kits for the front office to make sure that the front office has all the supplies that they would need in order to open up school and registration. And one of the most important things, we talk about PPE generally, and it's in the chat a lot, and it's been a part of a lot of conversation, but actually what's more critical is to train people how to use the PPE properly. When we first started doing food nutrition, and we purchased masks for the entire staff, a lot of people were touching the mask too frequently, and they had to get familiar with utilizing the mask and how to take it on and off properly. So the first couple of weeks of the Starting Strong will include getting staff trained on how to properly use all the PPE that we're bringing into place. And by Friday, we're going to have an internal system that will allow for school sites and departments to notify us when they're running short on critical PPE, and we can deliver it directly to the school site. So that's a little bit of an update on our PPE, and I think we're going to open it up for some questions now. Actually, I just noticed one question in the chat that I just wanted to hit, that there is a great point that a lot of people are talking about with respect to really young children wearing masks. And one of the things that they're looking into is actually, there's really only two sizes of masks that are currently publicly available. One is for children, one is for adults. They are currently designing a smaller mask for kindergartners, first grade and second grade that we're looking into right now, that will make it easier for younger children to wear masks.
And so Preston, just to bring up some of the themes that are coming up in the chat. One, I think just a lot of questions around, and this might be for Sandra, around how will distance learning be better? And I know that there were some of the points that you already made in your presentation, but just some reassurance around that. And then some clarity again around some of the outdoor education options that might be available.
Thank you, Sandra. So I mentioned that we will have a scope and sequence that will provide teachers guidance on in each of the subject areas, the specific standards that will be a focus, and then how to connect the curriculum to those standards. So one way of looking at it is that when we went into the spring, we had school sites at different areas of instruction in that scope and sequence. And starting off the year, we're providing this information so that way teachers can follow that scope and sequence. And it is meant to be integrated with online learning platforms. We also received the feedback from our families and from our teachers that we had too many different platforms. And so there will be less platforms, but platforms that are able to do more in terms of instruction. So teachers don't have to weave through all the different learning platforms to create a full program for their students. In addition to that, we did provide many opportunities for professional learning at the end of the year and throughout the spring. And it will be different because we're able to offer those professional learning opportunities not only at the beginning of the school year, but throughout the weeks as we're launching. There are different sessions that we did for teachers, like Google Classroom and online learning. So in conjunction with the scope and sequence support, more opportunities for teachers to share best practices through Google Classroom, which started at the end of last year through the use of Google Classroom. We will heighten those opportunities for teachers to share. We saw some great collaboration happening across schools. So we're open to feedback, but that is our plan that we are launching so far.
Awesome, thank you so much. And Preston, some additional questions just around like custodial cleaning schedules and what that might look like.
Sure. That's something that we're in the process of developing right now, is the custodial cleaning schedules for each of these phases, so that we'll know what that is going to look like. And essentially what it would look like would be, you know, when we have a limited number of students in the building, we do feel like there will be run sheets that custodians will go through that will allow them to clean high-touch surfaces. After staff leaves, they're cleaning high-touch surfaces. I think in one of the models that Sandra had talked about, there's opportunities to do even deeper cleaning that would happen. One of the key things that would be built into like their runs would be checking for to ensure that the soap dispensers are constantly filled, to make sure that the bathrooms have been like the handles and things like that have been cleaned. So we're in the process of developing all that, and we definitely feel we will be sharing all of that publicly with the community as we develop those materials.
Thank you. And then also some questions that are coming up in the chat around support for special needs students. And I know that Sandra, you had mentioned a couple of these supports specifically in your presentation, but I'm wondering if we could have you or Jennifer Blake talk to some of those supports that will be available during this distance learning time.
Why don't we have Jennifer Blake, our Executive Director of Special Education, come forward and explain a little bit more about our special education planning.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here. Relative to special education, we are planning to align with the information that you all have received this evening of having our first 4 weeks of instruction really be focused on that strong start. This would be a time for our special education teachers to engage with families and students to make sure that they understand each child's unique strengths, interests, goals, and needs. In addition to that, we would be beginning special education evaluations for those students who need them, ensuring baseline and diagnostic testing for all of our students so that we have a firm understanding of their present levels, and holding IEPs when necessary. AB 77 also requires that each student with an IEP have a distance learning plan that clearly specifies what services would be provided during a distance learning context. So during those initial weeks of school, those will be made as well. From there, we are planning to bring back in, again, contingent upon our labor negotiations, specific groups of students for whom we know that distance learning has presented some unique challenges, which would be our students with more intensive needs and our students who are in our counseling, enriched, or mental health programs. As it pertains to distance learning services, we are doing a lot of work over this summer to plan for more robust supports through special education provided in distance learning. And this would include planning for dedicated time for our special educators and related service personnel to engage and collaborate with both families and general educators to make sure that the work that is being provided is accommodated and adapted based on students' individual needs. We also will continue to have ongoing weekly seminars for our staff and for our parents that are focused specifically on the platforms and accommodation tools that are available during distance learning to make sure that our families and our students and our staff have access to those tools and have the information they need on how to best use them. So we are continuing, of course, to plan as the new guidance comes out to make sure that we are adhering to both the state law and recognition of the important needs of our students with IEPs and the services that are encapsulated within them. We encourage any family who has additional questions to reach out at the onset of the school year and request an IEP meeting as well, which of course is the best platform through which to discuss their individual students' any concerns or questions that they have.
Great, thank you so much. Also, Sandra, some questions that are coming up around attendance and grading. If you could clarify what the policy is going to be around that.
Yes, so for attendance, we are required through AB 77 to take daily attendance. So we will be taking attendance, which is a change from what we did in the spring. We did track participation, and that was a form of attendance, but this will be slightly different in that AB 77 calls for daily attendance taking in contact with peers or staff. So ARIES will be used to track students' attendance just as it has been used before. So families should expect that there is daily participation for their students and for their children. The next thing is grading. So we are in current discussions right now around grading. We are proposing that students go back to grading, that they receive letter grades, and that for any grades that would be assigned as not satisfactory, like an F, or a low number for elementary, because the grading system is different for elementary. There are specific interventions that would need to happen prior to assigning that grade. And that's what we are working through right now with our labor partners, specifically the Oakland Education Association, our teachers, counselors, and people with certificated credentials. So that is still pending, but that is our proposal, our recommendation right now.
Great, thank you so much. And then Christy, I know that you're on as well. There were a few questions earlier that came up around early childhood education and the plans there. I'm wondering if you could take a couple of seconds to talk about what the plans are for our preschoolers.
Yeah, so we are looking at possibly reopening a couple of centers as a pilot to offer some in-person services, and then also following the guidance from the state about what distance learning looks like for early learning. There hasn't been clear guidance on that yet, but we are looking to reopen a few centers and then communicate with those families.
Great, thank you so much. And are there other themes that any of the other staff members want to lift up from the chat that they're seeing, either on Zoom or on the YouTube live stream?
Sandra, there is a question about how teachers would support both students on distance learning and those in hybrid learning.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I don't see Sandra's picture there. I'm happy to, oh, there she is. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't hear John's question that he said.
It was around how teachers would be supporting distance learning as well as in-person learning.
So this is a big area for us to dive into with teachers. I keep referring to what is scope and sequence. So just want to say a little bit about what that looks like. It is a daily plan that teachers can follow that provides them what to do in each of the curricular areas, or each of like math, language arts. So what we're designing right now is how to combine both distance learning, so internet learning, and in-person learning, and when to implement the different aspects of that type of learning. So as the phases come in, we have to adjust what the instruction looks like. So we do have a suggested way of doing that that we'll take to our teachers and our principals for feedback, but we are going to have a suggested way of how to integrate both distance online learning and learning in person, because it does take management of the different groups, and it's pretty complicated. It's not just an easy thing to start groups, and so we do have to help our schools to implement that type of model. It will take a lot of planning and preparation to implement that model.
Great, thank you so much. And I know that there were definitely questions around the professional development that will be available to teachers, and I know that there's a lot that's planned for this summer. And then some other questions as well that around, just sort of acknowledging how COVID is spreading in our community, that it is really drastically impacting our Latinx and our African American communities in particular. I do want to acknowledge that that is true, and it's definitely something that is really concerning that we are thinking about and wanting to make sure that our staff and students are safe as they are coming back to school. And Preston, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we have been working to improve our safety protocols at the food distribution sites over the summer around the safety partners, and what some of that work has looked like as a model for the school year.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things as, the Starting Strong model actually is built somewhat on what we did in the food distribution. And when we started it, we knew that there was a compelling reason for us to begin distributing food to families. There's 25,026 students in OUSD that depend on free and reduced lunch. And so as the guidance changed from at the very beginning when we started, there was no guidance around wearing masks. It was basically social distancing and wiping down surfaces. And so what we developed was a team of people that were safety partners, that were some risk management, some informed by different departments, that began going and observing at each of the sites. And we created a list of protocols, and they would check for critical things like, are people wearing their masks properly? Are people maintaining social distancing? Did the surfaces get wiped down at every hour within the food distribution? And so that model of continuous improvement was really powerful for us as we developed the procedures. And so if we're starting in a distance model, for example, the symptoms check that staff will have to learn to do and to be able to report out their symptoms, that is something that we need to build a practice around and make sure people know how to use the system. And so a lot of these things can be, you can develop healthy systems if you're constantly asking questions, how can we get better? And we continually do that after every food service on Mondays and Thursdays. And so that is definitely a practice that we see schools and the community engaging in over the course of the next school year.
Awesome, thank you so much. I also see some questions coming up just around safety protocols and kind of what to do around temperature screening, as well as what to do if there's a positive case. The county has developed a series of guidelines around what to do if there is a suspected case of COVID, or if there is an exposure, how to notify people, how to contact trace, how to recommend isolation for anyone who is exposed. And so those are the protocols that we will also be following, that were developed by the County Public Health Department. And in a nutshell, essentially, it's if someone in that cohort was exposed to someone who is symptomatic or who is coming back positive, that entire cohort is notified, and that they are recommended to isolate for 14 days. And so, all of this to say that there will be a tremendous amount of flexibility that will be asked should we return to any form of in-person learning, to know that just because our doors are open doesn't mean that it is going to be consistent, because we may be told to shelter in place again by the county, by the state, or because there was an exposure on campus. And so a reminder for those of you who joined us late, we are starting the year in distance learning. We will be in distance learning for up to the first 4 weeks, and are in negotiations now to determine what the remainder of the year should look like. So we are preparing for blended models. We are preparing for supporting our students if they are able to come back on campus, because we know that we don't want to plan for that at the last minute. We want to have a plan for that for when it is safe to bring students back. But at the same time, we're making sure that the distance learning start to the year will be stronger than the spring, where we had to pivot very suddenly into that distance learning for the last 2 months of the school year. So the professional development over the summer will largely be focused for teachers around distance learning and making sure that we have that strong start to the year, and that our operations work will be around preparing our physical campuses for when we are able to bring some students back, and parents will have the option to choose distance learning for the course of the year if that is the right choice for themselves and for their families. Jody, were there any other questions that you saw coming up in the chat that we need to address?
There is a question about, I think you hit most of them. There's lots of questions. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the guide coming out and also how we'll follow up with continuing to stay in communication from now until August 10th and then afterwards.
Yeah. So this presentation, the video as well as the deck, will be available on our website. The deck will be translated, so it will be accessible to families who speak languages other than English. And we have been sending out and will continue to send out weekly updates about how we're preparing for the new year. And we will also be planning a series of office hours with our consulting physicians from UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, so that if anyone has really specific health and safety questions about school reopening, but also about their children and COVID and generally, and understanding how the disease works, you will be able to access our doctors during that time to get more information. And if Dr. Long is still on the line, I see that there are a few questions that are coming up, or Lee, if you are on the line, questions that are coming up around the temperature screening. And the county guidance around temperature screening is actually that we do what they're calling a passive symptom check, so that we are asking students and we're asking staff if they have symptoms, but we are not actively taking temperature, and sort of the rationale behind that. Dr. Atkinson, are you able to speak to that recommendation from the county?
I am. Hi, thank you. So the issue with the thermometers by which you could do a distant temperature check have really been shown to have a lot of error in them. So they will measure a normal temperature when you do an actual temperature, somebody might have a fever. So it's a false sense of security to think that a normal temperature with those sort of the temporal or the one that goes on the forehead thermometers. So the best way to actually get a temperature is requiring people to be up close. And then as someone said in the chat, if somebody is on medication, that can change their temperature. And then the final piece is the ambient temperature, so the temperature of the air. So if it's a cold day or a hot day, or you were sitting in the car with the sun on your forehead, can also affect your temperature. So that's why many places have moved away from doing temperature screenings, just because they're not accurate and they give you a false sense of security.
Thank you for that. Also, just seeing in a message in the chat around when we're opening, that is based on labor negotiations. That's absolutely true. So we are starting in distance, and we are negotiating all of our labor contracts right now to determine exactly what the school year is going to look like, and are really here to just provide some level of information to families so that they can begin preparing for the start of the year. So I want to make sure that we get to some next steps as well. So Jody, could we go ahead and move on? So these are some of the things that are upcoming. So we have today, which is really our update for families. And this coming in 2 days, we're going to have a PSAC meeting, the Parent and Student Advisory Committee, and just a real appreciation for a number of members of the PSAC who participated in the action team in the last 2 months to create a lot of these recommendations and provide feedback to our staff. It was really critical to have parents as a piece of the planning team to help guide us in terms of what devices we were buying, what platforms we were using, what kinds of blended models we should be thinking about. That was just a really critical voice. I want to appreciate them. Principals are coming back early, so we are providing some paid PD time for principals and their instructional leadership teams to come back early. There's a lot of new things that are going to be happening this year, so that we want to make sure that they have enough time to wrap their mind around and begin planning for things like instructional minutes, which are new, and schedules, which will be new, as well as making sure that we have that strong start to the year. First day of school remains August 10th. That day will be online, and that we will have that first phase as distance learning. And that we will be doing the technology distribution with Oakland Undivided over the course of those first few weeks of the school year. So a reminder for those of you around the technology distribution is that when we went into distance learning in the spring, we were loaning out OUSD devices, OUSD Chromebooks, to families. And we will continue to do that to make sure that families have access to a device, that families have access to the internet to access distance learning. Oakland Undivided is a separate campaign that was really focused on getting to one-to-one so that every student had their own personal device that was theirs that they could keep. And so that we are making sure that every student who needs a computer is able to get one at the start of this year, so that they could keep that over the course of the duration of their academic career. And so that's the work that's happening around right now, waiting for the devices to arrive and making sure that they are allocated to the sites appropriately. So families look for a survey around your specific family's technology needs towards the beginning of the school year so that we can get that information and get those devices out to your children. Okay, next slide, please. And then also just want to point people to a tremendous set of resources at Family Central. This was a website that our family engagement team created in the spring, again, with sort of very little notice to make sure that families had access to the information they needed about how to support their students with at-home learning, about where to get food over the course of the closures, how to access health services, and that this is a website that we're continually adding to, that we have video resources, that we have websites, that we have information in multiple languages for you to access, and it will continue to be a resource where we're placing information for families. And that's in addition to another website that we have for teachers. It's called Teacher Central, where we've been centralizing where teachers can go to get access to the resources that they need to provide high quality distance learning to their children. Okay, next slide. Okay, that was a lot of information. I definitely heard in the chat that that was a lot and it's making people's heads swim, so I appreciate you for sticking with us for this long. It is a really complicated situation and I know that you know that. And so I just want to acknowledge how hard everyone is working as parents, as teachers, students in getting through this incredibly unprecedented situation. There is more information that is just a greater level of detail that we wanted to make available to everyone in the name of transparency around curriculum development, around the office hours with our doctors, information from AC Transit, who are doing physical distancing and fewer riders on their buses, and about how we're going to continue to communicate with you over the course of the next few weeks specifically, but also over the course of the next year, that we want to make sure that lines of communication with our families are open. So again, this deck will be available online. It will be translated so that you all can look through this information at your leisure. Okay, and with that, it is 7 o'clock. We will be taking the questions in the chat that we didn't get a chance to answer. We will be putting it in a frequently asked questions document that will be accessible on the OUSD website. So if you didn't get your question answered, I apologize, but look for the document that will be posted online. We have one already that's prepared today from some of the previous engagements, and so you'll be able to start by looking through some of those and see some of the answers to questions that didn't get asked tonight. All right, so thank you everyone. Please stay safe. Please wear a mask when you go outside. And we look forward to seeing your kids back online on August 10th.